RL4 Story Elements deals with the development of character and how that character impacts the surroundings of his story. Now, you might think at first that when we're talking about characters in a story, this has nothing to do with real life. But the truth is that fiction is based on real life, and understanding how a character interacts with his literary world can help us understand how people in the real world interact with their worlds as well. So it's a valuable skill to have, no matter what you end up doing. Taking a look at this particular target, we'll start at the 1 level. I can explain the impact of the author's choices regarding how to develop the characters in the story. So in other words, you can tell me how the character is developed, but you're not breaking it down. You're not giving me any analysis, which is the 2 level. So at the 2 level, you'll be able to give me proof, basically. You're breaking it down, giving proof. Okay. But still just of the characters. Now at the 3 level, proficiency for you, this is where you start adding in new skills. It's not only talking about the character, still analysis by the way, not only talking about the character, but also relating the characters to the other elements of the story. How does the character impact the rest of the story? And this is really where we get into that real world application, considering how people interact with their surroundings. At the 4 level, we're analyzing the impact of both the character and the other elements, but we're giving very specific details. In other words, we're doing a close reading. You're going to give me quote proof. Okay. I must have quotes for a 4. Now, since this particular target starts with talking about character at the 1 and 2 level, we'll start there in our analysis of story elements themselves. First thing to consider, since we're talking about character, is characterization, or how the character is developed. And there are 2 methods of doing that. There is direct versus indirect. In direct, the author or narrator tells us how a character is. The man was tall, Jerry was happy to survive the attack. In indirect, which is more common, the character's actions show us how he or she is. The man towered over the woman, a tree compared to the grass. Jerry sobbed in relief as the would-be murderer was dragged away by the police. These are action verbs. We have to infer that the man was tall and that Jerry was really happy. We also should consider character types, and you've probably heard most of these terms before. You've got your basic protagonist, the good guy, and your antagonist, the bad guy. You've got your foil, he's usually an opposite to the protagonist quite often, and not necessarily in the sense that he's bad, but his characteristics or his mannerisms are opposite of the protagonist. If the protagonist is very slow to act, the foil might be quick to act. You've got your confidant or your best friend. You've got stock characters who don't get a lot of development. Sometimes they may be main characters and they may be stock characters for a reason. Comedies often rely on them, for instance. The sweet and innocent lovers who we root for, we want them to get together. The stingy old man, the pantaloon, doesn't have to be a man, it's just a person who is stingy and grumpy all the time. We call that the stingy old man or the pantaloon when it comes to the stock character term. The braggart soldier, again, does not have to be a soldier, but someone who is just full of themselves. They think they're just the bomb and that everything they do is perfect. The befuddled parents who have no clue what's going on in their parents' or in their kids' lives, but again, it doesn't even have to be parents. It might be the best friend, someone who just doesn't understand what's really going on. The impertinent servants, and again, this does not have to be a servant, but people who are very sassy and step out of place. Perhaps giving advice where advice isn't wanted. And then the trickster, the character who is always making trouble for others. You can also talk about dynamic versus static characters. Dynamic characters change, static characters remain the same. And usually your main characters are going to be dynamic, and your static characters are just going to be background characters. But again, not always the case. Sometimes we might learn a lesson from a static character who is a main character. And so they are static to show us what not to do, usually. As far as plot goes, again, probably not much new here. We've got your basic hook, and there are different methods of doing this. Common ones, action hook, jumping right in, dialogue. Got characters talking right away to try and lure us in, often setting too, or where we're located. Exposition is the background of a piece, and this could include introducing the characters, giving a bit of background on who they are, usually giving the setting if it hasn't already been provided to us in the hook. The conflict, of course, is the problem, and there are several different types of conflict that we should make note of. We could have character versus character. I'm going to abbreviate here, character. It could be character versus self. They have an internal problem. It could be character versus society. They don't fit in with their society. It could be character versus nature. Okay. So any of those would be fair game for conflict. Rising action, I like to think of as a series of action and response against the conflict. So you've got a problem. It's an attempt to solve the problem. And then usually doesn't work out right away. And then usually some reflection. But it's basically anything that occurs during the story before the climax, which is the turning point for the main character. Usually things are turning better for them, unless it's a tragedy. Okay, and this has to directly relate to the conflict. You might have multiple conflicts, so if it seems like the climax doesn't connect to one, check the others, what other problems existed. Following action and resolution, I like to clump together anything that happens after the turning point. Usually we hear the end results of the actions. Where do the characters end up? What state are they in? And we can talk about how characters interact with each of these plot elements as well. We also need to consider setting. Remember, setting is the time, place, climate, and culture is really key here because there's quite often conflict related to this. In many stories, that's the case. Characters don't really fit in with their culture that they find themselves living in. It often reflects changes in plot and characterization. You can consider point of view as well. First person, I'm telling the story. Second person, rare in literature and fiction, you. And third person, he, she, they, etc. We can also talk about objective, limited, and omniscient. In objective, we get just one person's point of view or very little information. Into character thoughts. In limited, we get some insight. Think first person telling us how they feel. In omniscient, we know all character thoughts. So most often paired up with third person, unless you have a character who happens to read minds, in which case it could be omniscient as well. We can consider the mood of the piece as well. This is the emotion of the piece. Is it positive or negative at bare minimum? What kind of emotion is it meant to evoke in us, the reader? Again, this often will change over the course of the story and reflect the changes in the plot and the characterization. Theme, of course, we talked about before. It's the main idea or message in a work of literature. Many works, as we know, have multiple themes which build together, and the characters are usually the key force in revealing those themes. What they learn, we learn from as well. Now, questions to consider when you are doing an analysis of character development, especially in relation to other elements of the story. This first bit of questions will really relate just to the 1 and 2 level. So if you can answer these, you'll really be at 1 and 2 level. For who is the character, you can simply describe the character in your observation. What kind of person is he or she? And then consider how we know. Direct characterization or indirect. This is where you'd give proof, quotes from the text if you want to forward. And you're going to go on and answer the rest of these. Pull quotes that show direct or indirect, or if there's not much of one, then it's okay to show just indirect characterization, for instance. If you want to move up into that proficiency level and get beyond just the characterization, here's where we'll start that line. These particular questions talking about the impact of the character. How does the character impact other characters? In other words, if the character does something, how do other characters view that action or the other character? How does the character impact events at each point in the plot? So what is the main character doing that's important for the hook? for the conflict, for the rising action, for the climax. Like, what are their actions that lead into those elements of the plot? How does the character fit into or not fit into his or her setting? How does the point of view impact our view of the character? In other words, and this will often be related to mood too, so you might combine these two. Based on what's happening and how the character portrays it, does that influence how we view the events and other characters? And then how does the character reveal the themes? So in other words, you'll need to know what the themes are, and then how does the character's actions and their dialogue and what they do show us what those themes are and what we should be taking away from the story. Okay, and we'll look at our example piece for the literature standards. Poem, Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, which we looked at before. And you might think, oh, a poem, like we can't really analyze this for story elements, but some poetry is considered narrative poetry. It does tell a story, and I would say that this particular poem does in fact do this and is a valid example for analyzing. I'm going to zoom in here so we can see a little bit better. We'll start some analysis. Okay. So our first question is, who is our character here? And given that this is told from first-person point of view, we know that because we've got I saw him down here, and we've got we, he's including himself with that group, we know that our character is a soldier. And I would say it's fair game to say that he's tired, damaged, if you will. And I'll make that claim looking at the language. They're cursing through the sludge. They are trudging. They're marching asleep. They're limping. They're blind. They have fatigue. They're deaf. So he's tired. He's damaged. And that I would add in based on his dreams, the dreams that he has, and how terrible they are about this man who died of the gas or was damaged by the gas. I think we can assume that he probably died. So as far as who is a character, a tired, damaged soldier, how do we know? Is this direct or indirect? Well, nowhere in here do we have our narrator telling us this is how I felt. We have to make inferences based on the actions. The fact that he's bent double, that he's cursing as he goes through the sludge, that they're trudging. So we have a lot of indirect characterization. And these are already underlined in the text as giving proof. You want to make sure that we do that. What is the impact of the character? What role or character type does this particular character fill in the story? I think it'd be fair to say that our narrator is the protagonist of the story. We are meant to feel for him. And if we didn't believe that, we can look and see when he actually turns and talks to us. We get a little bit of second person here. If you in your own smothering dreams could pace, if you could hear, I mean, he's really trying to make us feel what he felt. And generally we get that feeling with a protagonist. So we'll mark it there. Abbreviate for space saving. How does the character impact other characters? Well, we know that he is primarily just moving along with the group of soldiers that he's with. When he sees a soldier actually end up getting caught up in the gas, the most that he physically does is throw him in the back of a truck. We flung him in. So as far as like physical actions and interaction impacting other characters, not much. But when he talks to us, the audience, even though we aren't a character, we might consider that he is trying to encourage us to not believe in the war. So as far as impact on other characters, he wants the audience to see the true horrors of the war. Which is why he's showing us this scene from his memory, this man dying in the gas. How does the character fit into or not into his or her settings? Well, there are a couple different ways you can look at this. I mean, if we look at the end piece, the general belief in war of the general population, the soldiers who were not necessarily there, or the people who were at home sending their soldiers off, they would want war to be like that final saying, dulce et decorum est pro patria more, it's sweet and it's right to die for your country. So in one sense, we have this as the overall setting. War zeal, go, die, fight, it's a good thing to do. But on the other hand, we have this whole text that shows that the soldier does not fit into that belief anymore. And that, in fact, he's the exact opposite, that there is nothing beautiful or right about dying for your country. So he does not fit into his setting, and we've got a whole bunch of proof that we could list. How does the point of view impact our view of the character? Well, again, we're seeing war through this soldier's eyes, and he's telling us what it was like for him, what he dreamed. And because it is so personal, it's going to make us identify with him and see his side as the right side. So that first person, and then that shift to second where he's talking to us, creates strong emotion in us for him. And then how does the character impact the mood of the text? Again, because this character is talking to us, because he's showing us the horror that he experienced, he's creating that same sense of horror in us, the readers. And then as far as revealing theme, what are we supposed to take away from this? The character is very clear about that. I mean, he says, you would not tell people to go and die for your country. This is one of the lessons we're supposed to take away. The horror of the war is supposed to show us that. His memories, his dreams are supposed to show us that. So we've gone through all of those questions. There's a lot to analyzing for character and character impact. Remember, if you want that 4, you need to give those specific details, mark up the text, write them down in small quote marks off to the side, but you're going to need those specifics.